James looked down at the eager faces surrounding him. His students, a vibrant mix of hope and curiosity, had waited all week for the town's annual fair. It was early autumn, and the air in this small southern town felt fresh, tinged slightly with the sweet smell of cotton candy and fried dough. James, a 26-year-old African-American schoolteacher, felt the energy of the day shifting uneasily within him. As he approached the bright tents and cheerful decorations that lined Main Street, he sensed a familiar tension. His students, oblivious at first, chatted excitedly about games and rides. But James's dark eyes quickly caught the subtle signs. An entrance marked private, manned by two white men, casually but firmly barring entry to some. It was not an official barrier, but an invisible one everyone knew existed. Across the street, Mary, a 22-year-old white college student, observed quietly. Her auburn hair caught in the breeze as she saw James and his students abruptly stop, confusion replacing excitement. "What's happening over there?" Mary asked softly, more to herself than anyone else. No answer came, only the muted laughter of friends who didn't notice or didn't care. Nearby, Antonio, a 30-year-old Latino construction worker, watched from a different corner of the festivities. Leaning against a streetlight, wearing jeans and a faded shirt smeared with dust from his workday, Antonio silently noted the selective welcome given by townspeople. He had long ago learned to observe from a distance, avoiding trouble by avoiding attention. At the bustling cafe beside the fairground, Sofia, a 24-year-old waitress of Asian heritage, moved swiftly between tables, balancing trays and patient smiles. Her heart sank with each dismissive glance or whispered remark from patrons assuming she couldn't understand their sharp words in English. Sofia understood perfectly, but her practiced smile hid all signs of hurt. Back on the street, James crouched down, looking his students in the eyes. They ranged in age and backgrounds, and now each wore disappointment openly on their faces. "Why can't we go there?" asked a soft-spoken boy named David. James hesitated, feeling the truth heavy in his throat. "Let's explore another part of the fair," he offered gently instead, guiding them away from the subtle cruelty of exclusion. As James moved his students away, Mary's eyes lingered on the scene. Her friends laughed again, pulling her attention back to safer topics, safer conversations, anything to avoid discomfort. Across from her, Antonio moved slowly toward a food stall, his shoulders burdened by the quiet realization that no matter how hard he worked or how honestly he lived, the invisible lines in town were drawn firmly against him. Inside the cafe, Sofia wiped down tables in silence, the cheerful noise of the fair outside feeling distant. Another long day, another long shift of pretending she was unaffected by the careless ignorance that surrounded her. The sun dipped lower, casting an amber hue over Main Street, the fair's lights beginning to glow brighter. Under the joyful colors of celebration lay the persistent shadow of indifference, unspoken but clearly felt. Antonio rose at dawn, as he did every morning. His small, modest home, situated on the outskirts of town, was quiet as he carefully navigated the dim hallway. The house still echoed with memories of his father, a man who had crossed a border hoping his children would have a different, better life. Antonio often wondered if his father's dreams had been too optimistic. By 6 o'clock, Antonio was already at the construction site. He put on his gloves and helmet, greeting his colleagues quietly with nods and muted smiles. The construction company, headed by a 42-year-old white man named Ronald, had a reputation for efficiency. Antonio had dedicated 8 years of his life here, building homes and offices that shaped the very landscape of the town. Today, however, Antonio felt unusually tense. He had overheard whispers in the crew, rumors of promotions, opportunities, and raises. He was hopeful, though experience had taught him caution. At 8:30, Ronald arrived in his large, freshly polished truck, stepping confidently onto the muddy ground. "Morning, gentlemen," he boomed cheerfully, shaking hands with a few workers nearby, mostly men who looked and talked like him. Antonio nodded respectfully, attempting eye contact, silently reminding Ronald of his consistent hard work. Ronald barely glanced his way. "All right," Ronald began, gathering the workers around him. "I have some news today. I'm promoting one of our hardest workers." Antonio's heartbeat quickened slightly. He held his breath, waiting. "Congratulations, Mike," Ronald announced, turning toward a younger worker, barely 25, white and friendly with Ronald's family. Antonio felt his chest tighten as cheers erupted around Mike, hands patting his back enthusiastically. Antonio clapped quietly, maintaining composure. Mike had barely been here 3 years. Antonio had trained him himself. As the crowd dispersed, Antonio approached Ronald cautiously. "Ronald," Antonio began respectfully, careful to keep his voice calm. Could I have a moment? Ronald looked slightly annoyed, impatiently checking his phone. Sure, Antonio. What is it? Antonio swallowed, choosing his words carefully. I was wondering why I wasn't considered for the promotion. I've been here a long time, working hard. I trained Mike myself. Ronald sighed, looking away briefly. Look, Antonio, you're a good worker, but… Ronald hesitated, then shrugged dismissively. You should be grateful to have the job at all. Many people would jump at the chance. Antonio felt his cheeks burn with silent anger, humiliation sinking deep. He nodded, turning away quietly. As he returned to work, the familiar bitterness grew sharper. Later that evening, Antonio stopped by the local community center to pick up his two young children, Rosa and Javier. He found them sitting attentively in a small classroom, captivated by James, the young schoolteacher who was gently reading a story aloud. James smiled warmly upon seeing Antonio, handing Rosa her backpack. Antonio admired James. Despite their different backgrounds, the two men had quietly built a friendship born of mutual respect and shared experience. James sensed Antonio's heavy mood immediately. Everything okay? He asked quietly. Antonio shrugged slightly. Same story as always. James nodded knowingly. You deserve better, he said softly. So do your kids. Listen, Antonio, if Rosa and Javier ever need extra tutoring or help, I'm here, no charge. Antonio hesitated, pride struggling with gratitude. Eventually, gratitude won. Thank you, James. Maybe I'll take you up on that. As Antonio left the center, his children chatting excitedly beside him, the weariness returned. The future seemed like a long, uncertain road. Every step forward met with an invisible wall. At home later, after dinner, Antonio watched Rosa and Javier quietly doing their homework. He thought again about Ronald's words, the dismissive ease with which he'd brushed away Antonio's years of hard work. He wondered how many times he would have to accept being second best before it was considered enough. Outside, evening settled slowly, shadows drifting quietly across the rooftops. Antonio looked out the window, silently promising himself, and his children, that someday he would find a way to overcome the barriers placed in front of them. Until then, he knew, he would keep working, keep enduring, keep waiting for the moment when equality became more than just a word, when opportunities truly reflected the efforts and sacrifices he'd made. But tonight, as Antonio closed his eyes, he couldn't help feeling the painful truth. That equal start he dreamed of was still too distant, obscured by prejudice, indifference, and the silent complicity of a town unwilling to change. The morning shift at the Sunrise Cafe was always chaotic, a swirl of chatter, laughter, and the clink of porcelain cups against saucers. Sofia moved quickly between tables, balancing a full tray effortlessly. She offered smiles that felt increasingly forced, disguising exhaustion from beneath carefully maintained composure. At 24, Sofia had already spent 3 long years working here, in the very heart of the small southern town she hoped would become home. Each day, though, it seemed more apparent that this acceptance would remain forever out of reach. She had become used to the sidelong glances, the whispered comments. Can she even understand us? They would say. The assumptions made about her were endless and exhausting. Today was especially crowded. A large group of college students sat noisily in the corner, their laughter filling every space, bright and careless. Sofia approached them cautiously, notebook in hand. Are you all ready to order? She asked, her voice calm and professional, without any noticeable accent. Yet the response was always the same. A giggle here, an exaggerated pronunciation there. Yes, miss, one of the students said, overly slowly, smiling smugly at his friends. We'll have 5 coffees, please. Sofia wrote quickly, trying to ignore the heat rising in her cheeks. Anything else? She asked, voice unwavering. That's all, he replied mockingly, as his friends dissolved into barely suppressed laughter. Nearby, Mary sat quietly, sipping her coffee alone. She had noticed everything, the students' rudeness, Sofia's quiet struggle, and the surrounding diners' comfortable indifference. Mary, usually hesitant to intervene, felt an unexpected pang of guilt. She knew some of those students from her own classes. Sofia returned moments later with their orders, her practiced smile strained but intact. As she turned away, she heard them mimicking her imagined accent again, giggling at their own cruelty. Mary finally moved to action, stood abruptly and approached their table, pulse quickening. Come on, guys, she began softly. That's not funny. Leave her alone. A sudden silence descended. Faces turned toward Mary, eyes wide in surprise. The young man who had mocked Sofia leaned back confidently, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about, Mary? We're just having fun," he said dismissively. "She doesn't even mind, right?" All eyes turned to Sofia, who stood frozen a few feet away, clutching a tray tightly. The expectation was clear. Silence was required. Sofia felt the weight of countless moments like this pressing against her voice, urging her toward compliance. She glanced briefly at Mary, grateful but helpless. "It's fine," Sofia murmured, almost whispering, as shame rose within her for not daring to speak louder. Mary watched her retreat into silence with a sinking heart. The students smiled knowingly at Mary, triumphant, confident that their cruelty had no consequence. Feeling isolated and powerless, Mary returned silently to her seat. From the kitchen doorway, Elizabeth, the 35-year-old cafe owner, had witnessed everything. Tall, neatly dressed, Elizabeth carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who saw everything but rarely intervened. She hesitated, thinking briefly about speaking up, but quickly convinced herself it would only complicate things. Sofia's relief at finishing her shift was tempered by the sting of humiliation that lingered long after the cafe door closed behind her. Walking slowly home through familiar streets, she allowed herself to imagine another place, another life. But deep down, she feared that acceptance might always be elusive, conditional upon silence and endurance. At her small apartment, Sofia stared out the window, watching shadows lengthen along quiet streets. She wished she could speak openly about her hurt, to scream into the indifferent silence around her. But experience had taught her that speaking out rarely changed anything, and often made things worse. In her tiny kitchen, Sofia brewed tea quietly, reflecting on Mary's small gesture. It had been the first time anyone had openly acknowledged what Sofia faced daily. The gesture had failed, perhaps, but it mattered. It meant someone had noticed, someone had cared. Across town, Mary also sat alone in her room, replaying the scene again and again. She felt both embarrassed by her inability to make a difference and frustrated by her peers' ignorance. She realized clearly now. Silence wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. And yet she didn't know how to truly break free from it. As the evening darkened into night, Sofia rested her head, eyes heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. For one brief moment, she allowed herself to dream, a fragile vision where she was seen, heard, valued not for her silence, but for her voice. But soon sleep took her, returning Sofia to reality, where she knew the morning would bring another day at the cafe, another day of quiet endurance, a day where acceptance remained beyond words, just out of reach. James had always believed in progress. He had grown up hearing stories of struggles overcome, battles won quietly and loudly by people who simply refused to accept inequality as a given. Yet, at 26, standing quietly beside his wife Rachel, looking up at the neat, modest home in a new neighborhood, he wondered if their own struggle was just beginning. Rachel, at 29, was warm, patient, and resilient. Her strength often balanced James's frustrations. Together, they had carefully chosen this neighborhood, believing it would offer their future children safety, opportunities, and perhaps more acceptance. It was predominantly white, but James hoped, optimistically, that times had changed enough to make that irrelevant. On their first afternoon in the new house, James and Rachel unpacked slowly, pausing occasionally to greet passing neighbors. Yet each greeting they extended was returned awkwardly, with forced smiles, brief nods, and a palpable unease. By evening it was clear, though no one had openly voiced it, that their presence here was unwelcome. The following days revealed the depth of that unease. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings never came. Rachel's gentle greetings to neighbors on their morning walks were often ignored or returned with barely concealed irritation. James felt helpless as he watched Rachel's optimism slowly fade. One Sunday afternoon, James noticed a group gathering in the yard of their neighbor Liam, a 28-year-old white businessman who was respected and influential in town. James observed discreetly from his window as Liam spoke emphatically, his voice occasionally rising enough to reach James's ears. "It's not personal," Liam was saying, voice confident. "But our neighborhood has standards. We can't let just anyone move in and change things." The murmur of agreement from the neighbors tightened James's chest painfully. He closed the window quietly, bitterness welling up. The message was clear. Their presence was perceived as a threat, their dreams secondary to others' comfort. That night, James paced anxiously in the living room, trying to manage his anger and disappointment. Rachel watched him calmly from the sofa, her voice soft but firm. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, James," she said quietly, though her own voice carried a hidden sadness. "We can't let them push us away. This is our home too." James sighed, sitting beside her, holding her hand tightly. "But how can we ever belong here if they refuse even to acknowledge us?" Rachel was silent, having no answer. Their growing isolation soon touched every part of their lives. James's students at the community school, children who had previously respected and admired him, slowly adopted their parents' quiet prejudice. They became distant, cautious, less open. His once vibrant classroom felt increasingly tense, his energy drained by trying to bridge divides others insisted must remain. Their neighbor Liam never directly spoke to them. Instead, he ignored their greetings, looked through them on the street, reinforcing the invisible barrier separating them from acceptance. James often wondered what fears or prejudices drove Liam's hostility, but no answers ever came. One rainy afternoon, Rachel arrived home quietly shaken, having overheard another mother at the local grocery store whispering that the neighborhood was no longer what it used to be. Rachel had always carried herself proudly, but James saw clearly that something inside her had begun to fracture, worn down by the unspoken but persistent cruelty around them. That evening, James stood silently on the porch, watching raindrops blur the streetlights. He felt helpless, angered, and saddened by the realization that despite all their effort, their humanity was still questioned. He thought again of the ideals he'd grown up believing, that the world was becoming more just, fairer. Yet here they stood, in their carefully chosen home, feeling as foreign and unwanted as ever. In the quiet darkness, James felt an intense longing for someone, anyone, to acknowledge their dignity openly, to break this oppressive silence. But all that returned to him was the soft whisper of rain, indifferent and unchanging. Across the street, Liam also watched the rain, comfortably sheltered inside his neat, warm home. He felt no guilt, no regret. He saw his actions as protective, necessary to preserve his community's identity, an identity he'd never realized relied on excluding others. Late that night, Rachel slept restlessly. James sat awake, contemplating the future, the uncertain path ahead of them. His resolve was shaken, yet deep within him remained a stubborn hope that somehow, someday, the silence would break, replaced by voices willing to speak the truth, to acknowledge pain, and to heal. But as dawn crept into their quiet neighborhood, James feared that such a day remained distant, hidden behind barriers of prejudice stronger and deeper than he'd ever imagined. The silence surrounding their home was deafening, more powerful and condemning than any spoken rejection could ever be. The community event at the heart of town drew a significant crowd as daylight faded slowly into evening. Warm golden lights from street lamps and food stalls glowed invitingly, creating an atmosphere that promised friendliness and warmth. Yet beneath the festive appearance lay the same subtle divisions and whispered judgments that had shaped this town for generations. Liam stood near the central pavilion, relaxed and confident, a gathering of familiar faces around him. His charismatic presence effortlessly attracted attention he enjoyed and wielded well. Nearby stood Elizabeth, owner of the Sunrise Cafe, quiet but observant as always, keeping herself separate but connected, careful not to engage too deeply. Antonio, still in his dusty work clothes, wandered through the event feeling oddly disconnected. He'd come hoping to blend into the crowd, to momentarily forget the disappointment and frustration of his day. Yet his presence drew cautious glances, each quietly reminding him he was an outsider, tolerated but never truly welcomed. Liam's voice carried easily over the laughter and murmurs. "You know," he said loudly enough for several to hear, "I remember when our town had a clear sense of community. We understood each other. But lately—" Liam paused dramatically, gesturing subtly toward Antonio's distant figure. "Seems like anyone thinks they can just move in, change how we live." Several nodded knowingly. Elizabeth glanced uneasily toward Antonio, her heart briefly tugging at her conscience before she looked away again, deciding, as always, that involvement wasn't worth the discomfort. Antonio overheard clearly, his steps slowing involuntarily. The unfairness burned sharply in his chest. He hesitated, deeply tempted to respond, but years of careful self-control warned him against speaking up. Yet tonight, weariness and anger pushed him beyond usual restraint. Gathering courage, he moved closer. "Excuse me," Antonio began quietly, attempting to hold Liam's gaze firmly. "Have I done something wrong? Something that bothers you?" A tense silence enveloped them. Liam regarded Antonio coolly, slightly amused by his boldness. "Relax, Antonio," Liam said dismissively. "Nobody's accusing you of anything. We're just talking about preserving traditions. You understand that, right?" Antonio felt blood rush to his cheeks, humiliation mixed with anger. "I've lived here 8 years. I work hard, respect everyone. My children grow up here. Aren't we also part of this community? Liam smiled indulgently, confident in his response. Antonio, being here doesn't automatically make someone belong. It's not personal. It's about fitting in. Antonio opened his mouth to reply, but another voice intervened quietly, unexpectedly. That's not right. It was Mary. Her voice was steady but nervous. She'd approached unnoticed, overhearing everything. Eyes turned toward her, faces registering mild surprise and curiosity. I mean, it's unfair, Mary continued softly, her voice stronger with each word. Antonio and his family have every right to be here. How can we call ourselves a community if we exclude people who live among us? Liam looked momentarily surprised but quickly recovered, offering Mary a condescending smile. Mary, it's more complicated than that. You're still young, idealistic. Mary flushed, feeling the attention and scrutiny of the group around her. Antonio, grateful but realizing the conversation was already slipping away, watched silently, knowing her words had fallen on indifferent ears. Elizabeth, sensing the growing tension, quietly stepped away, choosing as always to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. She preferred the neutrality of silence, ignoring how her silence enabled the prejudice around her. Seeing Elizabeth leave, Mary felt suddenly isolated, unsure of her next words. Antonio, sensing her discomfort, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, whispering quietly, Thank you, Mary, but it's okay. Some conversations won't be heard, no matter how necessary. Mary felt a profound sadness at Antonio's acceptance, at the way his voice, and hers, had been casually dismissed. The group around Liam dispersed slowly, losing interest now that confrontation had been avoided. Antonio walked quietly toward home, head lowered, carrying the heavy weight of another unanswered plea for dignity. Mary lingered behind, feeling guilt and frustration. She had spoken up, yet her words had faded quickly into silence, dismissed as naive idealism. Liam watched Mary thoughtfully as she left, mildly unsettled by her challenge but quickly pushing aside his discomfort. He reminded himself that he'd done nothing wrong. He had merely expressed what many silently felt, but hesitated to voice. Elizabeth returned to her cafe, opening its doors quietly, relieved to escape from the uncomfortable situation outside. She told herself once again she was neutral, yet deep inside, she felt an uneasy stirring, a quiet voice reminding her that silence was its own choice, not neutrality at all. Later that night, Antonio sat on his porch, quietly staring into the darkness. He thought of Mary's courage, Liam's arrogance, and Elizabeth's silence. He reflected on the conversation that might have been, a conversation about respect, acceptance, humanity. But the conversation hadn't happened, drowned instead in the habitual silence that everyone found easier than truth. Antonio closed his eyes, weariness settling deep within him. He wondered sadly how many more conversations would never occur, how many voices would remain unheard, how much longer they would all pretend that silence wasn't itself a judgment, a refusal to acknowledge injustice. As the night deepened, silence stretched over the town, comforting for some, oppressive for others. A conversation forever waiting, always delayed, leaving unanswered questions hanging heavily in the air. The annual town festival had returned again, bringing with it bright banners, cheerful music, and the smell of food drifting through the warm evening air. Beneath the colorful festivities lay the unspoken yet powerful divisions that silently shaped the community, defining where one belonged or did not. James walked slowly through the bustling streets, accompanied by Rachel, whose calm demeanor had grown quieter over the year. They observed carefully from a distance, noting the carefree laughter of neighbors who had never truly accepted them. Rachel clutched James's hand tighter, as if holding on to strength neither fully felt anymore. Nearby, Sofia moved gracefully between tables outside the Sunrise Cafe, her practiced smile unwavering, though her heart had grown increasingly heavy. She carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken insults, knowing her silence only deepened the invisible barriers surrounding her. She placed drinks quietly onto tables, offering kindness to those who rarely returned it. Antonio stood by himself near a food stall, observing the familiar scene around him. Though the town had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, acceptance remained distant. He noticed Sofia, catching her eyes briefly, exchanging silent understanding born from shared exclusion. Mary stood near a small cluster of her peers, yet she felt distinctly separate. Her attempts to bridge the town's divides had been met with indifference, dismissed as youthful idealism. She now felt strangely alone among people she once considered friends. Her gaze drifted toward Sofia and Antonio, and she wondered sadly whether genuine connection across such divides was truly possible. Liam moved confidently through the festival, warmly greeting familiar faces, his comfortable assurance of belonging unshaken by the year's events. He saw James and Rachel from a distance, offering nothing more than a brief, dismissive nod, an acknowledgement only that they still existed, unwanted but tolerated. Elizabeth stood quietly behind the cafe's counter, watching Sofia serve customers. Elizabeth had carefully maintained her neutrality, never taking sides. Yet tonight she felt a quiet discomfort at her own silence, a faint awareness that neutrality had, in truth, reinforced the divisions she pretended not to notice. As night fell, the festival's lights shone brightly, colors blending in soft harmony, disguising the sharp lines beneath. The residents gathered near the stage, preparing for the evening's final performance. James and Rachel stayed at the outskirts, hesitant, aware they were still not fully welcome. Antonio lingered close by, eyes tired from the long journey of quiet endurance. From the stage, Liam addressed the crowd warmly, speaking eloquently about the strength of the community, its shared values, and collective identity. He celebrated a unity that existed only for those within certain invisible lines, ignoring the divisions that had shaped so many silent lives. As applause faded into the evening air, James turned to Rachel quietly. "Do you think it'll ever change?" he asked softly, genuinely unsure. Rachel's expression softened, hopeful yet saddened. "Maybe someday, but not easily and not soon. Not until people stop pretending the problem doesn't exist." Nearby, Sofia overheard their conversation, feeling the deep truth of Rachel's words. She met Antonio's eyes again, their shared gaze expressing mutual understanding of the invisible barriers surrounding them, barriers everyone saw but chose not to acknowledge. Mary stood close enough to overhear their words, guilt rising once more in her chest. She knew deep inside that her efforts had barely scratched the surface of this entrenched prejudice. She realized the comfort of silence had kept the community from confronting its most profound failures, herself included. Elizabeth quietly stepped outside her cafe, suddenly aware how deeply she'd hidden behind neutrality. She felt the growing heaviness of complicity in the divisions she had passively accepted. Yet even now, she hesitated, unsure how to break her silence, uncertain of the consequences if she finally did. Antonio watched the evening fade, knowing this invisible border defined every interaction in his life. He questioned his future, pondering whether he should leave, start fresh elsewhere, or continue enduring this endless quiet struggle. His children deserved better, yet he wasn't sure a better place existed. The festival ended quietly, people gradually dispersing, returning to homes defined by invisible boundaries and careful avoidance. Liam walked comfortably, undisturbed, sure that the harmony he celebrated was real, convinced nothing needed changing. James, Rachel, Sofia, Antonio, Mary, and Elizabeth each returned home separately, reflections heavy in their hearts. Each carried the painful realization that invisible lines were stronger than ever, reinforced daily by silence, indifference, and quiet complicity. Late that night, beneath a clear sky dotted with distant stars, the town lay quiet, peaceful on the surface yet deeply fractured underneath. Each of its residents knew instinctively where they belonged and where they did not. The border remained invisible but clearly defined, reinforced by everyday interactions, quiet nods, averted eyes, and unspoken judgments. James and Rachel stood silently outside their home, gazing at the empty streets. Rachel leaned softly against James, whispering quietly, "Maybe someday they'll finally see us." James sighed gently, looking up into the vast darkness above. "Maybe," he replied softly, knowing how distant that day seemed. Across town, Antonio watched his sleeping children, quietly promising himself he'd keep fighting, keep enduring, hoping someday their world might finally change. Sofia lay awake, wishing she could find the strength to speak openly, yet still uncertain if her voice would ever matter. Mary stared into the darkness, troubled deeply by her own complicity, aware her silence had made her part of the problem. Elizabeth finally acknowledged quietly to herself the cost of neutrality, wondering if she'd ever find the courage to speak. Only Liam slept peacefully, unaware or unconcerned by the invisible borders he helped maintain, comfortably certain the world was exactly as it should be. And so, beneath the gentle, indifferent sky, the town continued quietly, day after day, its invisible barriers intact, upheld by silence that all preferred. Some endured, and few dared to challenge. A silent boundary, clear as ever, waiting patiently for someone to finally cross it.